I did ask for the campaign groups to come because I think we're now into the period where we need maximum community and public engagement, and everybody in this room should be involved in some ways if you feel passionately about our NHS. We've had it since 1948, but we're now actually losing it very rapidly. And the introduction that you gave me, thank you very much, David, began with the NHS Bill, which will have its second reading on the 24th of February this year. It's unlikely to get through to that second reading, and it may even pass to March. And it will fall again. It will get no support because it's a private member's bill. It's been in the House of Lords twice, and it's now in the House of Commons 3 times. And I urge you, at the end of this talk, to look at www.nhsbill2015.org. That's the website, we can give it to you. Because the bill was drafted by my colleague Peter Roderick, who's a barrister, and I worked very closely with him, but we also put this bill out to consultation on several occasions. And in fact, the bill started off as a very short 6-clause bill and is now much, much longer and increases in size. And really the bill is necessary because the NHS has been abolished. Now, you may not believe that when you listen to the news, but actually what's happening on the news is part of that bigger story. The NHS is actually now being dismantled. We're into a very different scenario of a winter crisis. The NHS has been completely broken up, it's being dismantled, it's being fragmented, and it's being shrunk. And now the NHS is simply a funding stream. And I think that's really important to remember, that the systems are being torn down, the systems that have been in place to deliver universal health care. And this is the Health and Social Care Act is the act that has made this possible. And it's a 457-page act. So it shows you it hasn't really got it hasn't got the NHS in the title, which tells you a lot about it. It's a Health and Social Care Act. And the key part of that act is a removal of the duty to provide key services throughout England. And I think that's really, really important to remember, because everything, as the lawyers here know, flows from the law. And I can see there are some lawyers here, and that's really important to understand, the abolition of that duty on the Secretary of State. And I don't propose to go through all the legal bits of it. It's all on the website under the bill, and you can see the new bill and all the analysis. But the reason why this bill came about is because we fought very hard, as the Health and Social Care Bill was going through Parliament, to oppose the bill. And the really great tragedy is that the BMA and the colleges did not come out against it. If they had, we would have been in a different scenario altogether. And there were several opportunities for that to happen, and it didn't actually happen. And really one of the stalwarts in fighting the Health and Social Care Bill was David Owen in the House of Lords. And for about 3 or 4 months, as the bill was going through its final passage in the Lords, every weekend and every evening, my colleague Peter and I were in the office working, drafting briefing notes to take on as the clauses were going through, as it went through the House of Lords. And you can see those briefing notes on the website, where we were anticipating what would happen. And indeed, it is all coming to pass. So after the bill was passed, we were exhausted and we were deeply upset. And David Owen said, the only thing that you can do is draft legislation to reinstate the NHS. So that's where we started. So a lot of this is down to a handful of people in the Lords who really understood what was happening. Laura Finlay was another one, who really understood what was happening, and some of the Labour peers. So we really understood what was happening and took on the fight. But that fight really should, if we believe in the NHS, continue. Because this key part, everything flows from the law, and what's now being put in place are the elements of the American healthcare systems, and I'll try and explain a little bit about that. I don't know if any of you spent time in the US. I spent over a year as a Harkness Fellow about 30 years ago when I saw at first hand what it actually meant not to have a universal healthcare system. And I'll give you a little anecdote. One of the people that was a Harkness Fellow here and came to work with me was actually head of the medical department at San Francisco General Hospital. And his wife was the head of radiology. But his sister had a brain tumour, age 33. And she was wheeled into San Francisco General Hospital, into the operating theatre, and he was there, and his wife was there. And all of a sudden there was a commotion and whispers, and then she was told she couldn't have her operation. And the reason why she couldn't have her operation was because the health insurance company had not authorised it. So here was somebody with a well-defined and established need. So she had to get off her trolley, she had to go back to New York, and she had to wait a further 8 weeks with her brain tumour until finally the health insurer authorised it. Now, no amount of pleading on the part of the medical director or the head of radiology or the head of the services had any impact at all. That was her brother. And so I tell you this story because these are everyday stories in the US, the denial of care. And yet the US is a country that spends 18% of GDP on healthcare, so double us, double what we spend. It denies about a fifth of the population access to healthcare, so Obamacare has made very little difference, a little bit of a difference, but there are around 50 to 55 million people that have no real access to healthcare. And they're the working poor. That's really interesting. So it's the porters, the cleaners, the secretaries, or the people who are contract workers who are working for Uber or wherever, you know, they just have no access to healthcare. And it's also not only the most expensive system in the world, it's the most inequitable system in the world. So, personal bankruptcies are commonplace in America, as you know, but nearly 2/3 of those personal bankruptcies are due to healthcare bills. So, mothers must make decisions as to whether they have their breast cancer treated. Parents, families have to make these decisions, life and death decisions, on the basis of whether they can afford the healthcare and afford to bankrupt their families. And that is the basis of healthcare, because even if you're insured, you have enormous co-payments, they're called user charges. So when I was in the US, I had to take my little son to the hospital. The first thing that happened was my Visa card, proof of identity, and a week later the bills came through, because even though I had insurance cover, I got enormous bills. These were the co-payments, and this was for a relatively minor thing that was happening in the emergency department. So anybody who's experienced America knows that fear is part of the everyday life of every citizen. Fear of losing coverage, fear of illness and not being able to pay, fear of the co-payments, which actually reduce people to poverty levels, and fear of bankruptcy. And I'm not shroud waving, this is reality. My friends tell me they don't change jobs in case they lose their cover. You might change your jobs, or for their families as well. So these are the everyday reality. And of course the American healthcare industry is enormous. It comprises health insurance companies and private providers, which are integrated into what's often known as health maintenance organisations, or listen for this word, accountable care organisations. Now this word ACO, accountable care organisation, is now a word that's being imported into the UK, and you'll hear it a lot in England, being used by Simon Stevens. So the American healthcare system has really nothing. It's got islands of excellence in a sea of poverty and neglect. And it has got excellent healthcare, but it's not accessible to all and not universal. But that 18% of GDP is also extremely wasted. something like a third, according to the Institute of Medicine, which is a very venerable, august body. It produced a report in 2012 which talked about waste in the American healthcare service. So of that 18% of GDP, more than 6%, that is $1 trillion, so many zeros you can't imagine it, actually is spent on unnecessary care, over-treatment, under-treatment, billing, invoicing, marketing costs. Now, this isn't some radical think tank. It's not some communist subgroup. This is the Institute of Medicine that's produced this report, one of the most venerable, august, conservative organizations in the US. So that is the scale. And by unnecessary treatment, I mean people being admitted to hospital and having heart operations that they did not need. Hospital Corporation of America in Florida is under the indictment for fraud. What kind of system is it where doctors are instructed not to respond to patients' needs, but to find the treatment that they think they ought to have? And that is routine because the US Department of Justice has a special Department of Healthcare Fraud, which recoups billions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars every year due to healthcare fraud on the part of providers and insurers, fraudulent billing, overtreatment, and also the denial of care. And yet, this is a system, and it isn't a system, that our government is busy rapidly importing and has been all the ideas from this, and that forms the elements of this 457-page Health and Social Care Act. So that's very important to remember because there is no universal health care in America. There's nothing in the Constitution. There's no right to universal health care. And that was a right that was in the duty to provide in the Secretary of State for Health that came into place in 1948. And that's a duty that was there in place for all of that time. And of course everything flows from the laws, so structure follows function. And so because it was that duty to provide, that duty to provide was cascaded to the various areas which we knew as either health authorities or health boards in Scotland, which were geographic in nature, and they were contiguous. They were all joined up so that nobody could be left out, nobody could leak out of the system. And that duty was there, and it was delegated and devolved through the health authorities. And as well as that, the NHS was under public ownership, public control, and public accountability for the main part. There were bits of it where GPs were independent contractors, but they were not private, and that's really important to remember that difference. So the whole, in 1948, the health, following the war, there'd been the emergency bed service, the country was broke, local authorities certainly didn't want the hospitals that they inherited, they couldn't afford to look after them. And so the emergency bed service had been created in the war and was the first beginnings of giving people universal health care, was then enshrined in law in the NHS Act, 1946 Act. And that was there and designed, as Bevan said, to give freedom from fear. And that freedom from fear we've had for a long, long time. So long we've become complacent and we've forgotten what it means to watch your child's eye without having access to health care, to worry about the healthcare bills. But many countries in the world haven't forgotten, and the US hasn't forgotten, and we should remember that. And the NHS became the model maker for the rest of the world. It became the model maker for many European countries. Italy, Greece, Portugal, Spain. They all put in place their national health services as a result of what happened in the UK. And it was a time when the country was absolutely broke. It was on its knees. But a political decision was made. We can and we will afford it. So when the politicians tell you, we cannot afford an NHS, of course we can. That's absolutely ridiculous. We're spending 7% of GDP, and that's falling as a percentage of GDP on the NHS. Where has that decision come from, that we should spend less of our GDP on healthcare? Is that what the voters asked for? So first of all, it's absolutely affordable. And yet, the critique of an unsustainable, unaffordable NHS was there from its inception. The Treasury loathed the NHS. Because why should it give healthcare to old, uneconomically active, disabled people? And so there was always a fight, and this has been a constant refrain of the Treasury and politicians since 1948 that the NHS is unaffordable. And there are a number of myths that have sprung up with this unaffordability. First, we can't afford it. We can't afford it because we've got an ageing population and a demographic time bomb. That is completely lazy thinking. Report after report after report from the Health Select Committee, from Europe, from Canada, from across the world have shown we do not have a demographic time bomb. We have an ageing population, but they're healthy, they contribute more than they take out of the system. And indeed, the single biggest predictor of your healthcare costs are proximity to death, the last 6 months of life. So if you die at 20 or if you die at 80, that's the predictor, the last 6 months of life. It's not to do with an ageing population. And if anything, the problem of chronic diseases and multiple morbidities, what we're seeing is a fall. It's not inevitable. We're seeing a decline in these. So actually, these are a set of myths, and we've put some of them, these Mythbusters, up on the website. So the ageing population is one. It's not an inevitability. The age dependency ratio is actually falling. It's lower than it's ever been, so that means that people are giving more into the system than they're taking out of it. And the whole problem of these so-called multiple morbidities and chronic diseases, this is another shibboleth that we're facing. So the government has perpetuated, and lazy thinking and lazy speaking, it's very easy to say we've got this time bomb and it's unaffordable, and we really have to begin to rebut that. Because really the question is, where is the money going? Well, first of all, as you've heard, we've got, amazingly, in this time of austerity, the government has decided to take money out of the NHS. So as a percentage of GDP, it's falling. And so we've got the most sustained decrease in funding since 1951 in the NHS at the moment. And that's partly also because the government at the moment wants to break it all up, wants you to lose faith in it, so you increasingly will turn to using private insurance or pay out of pocket. Because the best way of forcing you to do that is to turn off both the funding and to create a crisis where hospitals and services are closing around the country and people can't get the access that they need. So what is the government doing? It's creating a US healthcare system, I said. And the reason, what's actually, if you think about the US, it's an insurance-based system. And it's insurance where it doesn't cover everybody. It's membership-based. So you belong to an insurance company. You are the members. But it's not geographic. It doesn't cover everybody in the region. It covers groups of people, clumps of people from all over the place. So that's the first thing. So it's non-universal and it's membership-based. Now, the Health and Social Care Act is non-universal. There's no duty on the Secretary of State to provide healthcare throughout England. Throughout England. Those words have gone completely. Instead, what the government has done is it's created new organisations called clinical commissioning groups. And they are the groups, like insurers, they're like public insurers now, that are buying your healthcare. And they are membership-based. Except for emergency care, they don't cover everybody in your area. And that's a really important distinction. They're not, It's okay, it's not me. It's a handbag. So that's the first important thing. And the second point is, of course, insurers have to be able to pick and choose. They're risk averse. So they pick and choose on the basis of risk, and that's called risk selection mechanisms. And so the government is busy designing in risk selection mechanisms. And it's done that in a number of ways. But first, before I explain how it's done it, I'm going to have to tell you a little bit about what's happened to the NHS, because this Health and Social Care Act was a culmination of a series of acts that begins in 1990 with the creation of the internal market, where health authorities, which once had integrated services, were divided into purchasers and providers, like a quasi-shadow market. So your health authorities were now buying services, and your hospitals and community services, instead of being services, were now set up as providers, and they would become body corporate. They became like firms, and they were responsible now for making ends meet, for their capital investment. They were trusts. They were almost, the idea was to be that they were freestanding and self-sufficient, no longer integrated into the health authority, no longer there to serve the needs of their local population as part of a planned structure. And that was the beginning of the internal market, the separation into purchase and providers and the language of the market. And with that, of course, came the next thing, the next piece, which was the privatisation, which was the PFI, the Private Finance Initiative. How many of you have heard of that? So this is really the sale and lease back, which some of you will be familiar with Southern Cross and the nursing homes. The reason why they're getting so indebted is because what's happening is that they're selling off their lands and buildings and they're leasing them back for astronomical charges. And so the government has now done that in many of the hospitals, especially many of the large teaching hospitals and foundation trusts, where the lands and the buildings have all been sold off, the family silver is gone, and we've entered into very expensive 30 to 60-year contracts, which are really, really problematic, because the individual hospitals or trusts are finding it very difficult to service that debt. So it's a form of debt servicing. So in the old days, there was no charge on your capital or your buildings. Since 1990, you've had to pay a charge. And I think you'll have seen the headline news today about the fact that hospital trusts can no longer afford their rental charges, and neither can GP practices. So they're going out of business because more and more money is now, instead of going into patient care, that money is now being diverted into shareholders and bankers and the owners of these new hospitals and GP practices and community services. So that's a huge chunk of money that is now moving out of the system, completely unaccountable, that we can't see because these contracts are commercial in confidence. So that was the first part of the breakup of the NHS, was after contracting, and then with that came the contracting out of the cleaning staff, the catering staff, the ancillary staff. And so this was really important, this creation of the internal market, the ideas of a firm. And then the next thing that happened is, having created these trusts, as the government called it, these bodies corporate, the government then decided to give them new freedoms to make them more entrepreneurial. So it created what's called foundation trusts, which then gave them the ability to make surpluses, to enter into more land deals, financial deals, joint ventures, to privatise the top floors, to enter into deals with Hospital Corporation of America or United Healthcare for private patient care. And now, under the Act, it has established foundation trusts as 49% private and 51% public. Now, this is a really big change. That means that foundation trusts, in theory, can generate up to 49% of their income from private patients. They've never been able to do that before. So what does that mean if you're a foundation trust? Remember, 2/3 of all foundation trusts are in serious deficit. They've got these enormous PFI debts. So what do? Well, you look to the private sector, but you've only got a limited capacity. You've got a limited number of beds and a limited number of staff. But you now have the freedom to generate more and more income from private patients. So what you do is that your beds and your staff can now be diverted into treating private patients in order to generate more income. So the NHS hospitals that we knew, and the beds have been falling really dramatically. They've fallen from 450,000 to just over 112,000. That's how few beds we have, and the population's nearly doubled since 1948. So what do you do when you've got these enormous pressures? You're faced with a deficit. The government says if you don't balance the books, we send in McKinsey's and the turnaround team. You generate more and more income privately, but that means fewer of your beds, fewer of your staff are now dedicated to NHS patients. And under the terms of the licence, the foundation trusts are able to reduce their services. Indeed, the government has said it expects them to reduce the services for NHS care. And so can the commissioners. So this is part of the big story. There's 49%, 51%. And of course, foundation trusts, if they can generate more and more income from private patients, it means also they can introduce more charging. So if you limit the amount of NHS care, so I say, well, I'll only do a hip operation. If you're an extremist, if you fractured your neck or femur or your pelvis, and I'll maybe give you your operation. But actually, we don't give you more than 2 physio sessions, and we'll start to charge you for the physio. Or if you've had your stroke, we'll give you a certain package of care, and this is what we're going to define. And you're seeing it a little bit with antenatal care and birthing services as well. The limits on the care that's being provided. And remember, the philosophy of the NHS was it was supposed to be not only universal, but the Secretary of State had a duty to promote a comprehensive health service. So the idea was that it would be truly comprehensive, cradle to grave. So these foundation trusts are now structurally 49% private, and indeed there's been a vast increase in the amount of private income. But of course, they're being heavily subsidised, the private patients, by the fact they're using NHS facilities, NHS beds, and NHS staff. But the trusts, because of the changes to employment law and conditions, they employ the staff and they can direct them to wherever the trust deems, the foundation trust deems they should go. So that's one part of the privatisation story. At the same time, as the government is cutting funds, it's bringing in these new initiatives. It's determined, the government, to devolve healthcare now to local areas. So you've got Devo Mank. And you've got these STPs. How many of you heard of STPs? These Sustainability and Transformation Plans. These are non-legal entities. They're called footprints. The government calls them footprints. And their primary purpose is to balance the books. Well, if every SDP is running a deficit of £1 billion across health and social care, how do you balance the books? You close, you cut services. So you'll have seen The Independent today that at least 24 A&E departments are threatened with closure. So it's really important to understand there is no magic solution. And my main anxiety about the whole Devo Mank is, of course, social care is charged for and NHS care is free at the point of delivery. And what we've already seen with all the long-term care is a major shift over the last 30 years of healthcare that was once free at the point of delivery, and that's for older people, that's mainly and people with disabilities. That care has been completely truncated, shifted to social care under the community care umbrella, where it's charged for and it's been broken up and it's been privatised. So local authorities today provide almost no in-house services at all. either for community care or care at home, or for long-term care, it's all with usually increasingly large multinational corporations. And that is the story of the last 30 years. So the whole lot has been broken up, privatised, and actually it's had a huge and shocking negative effect in terms of innovation, in terms of developments for older people. What we've got increasingly is like the US healthcare system is a warehousing in nursing homes and residential care of older people. And I think it's very interesting that the right-wing Republicans moved from defence when there was the peace dividend into the nursing and residential care sector and the health sector in the US. That's where they put all their money into growing up these great big corporations, and these are the very same corporations now that have moved in and are owning and operating our nursing home companies, but they're also now penetrating the NHS because there's an increasing amount, at least £10 billion worth of services are now being privatised. You've seen Virgin, who run the horrible train companies, that we have trains that we have to sit on and endure. They are now, Virgin has moved in, it's got £100 million contracts. So the government now is intent, so not only was the duty to provide that has gone, it's been replaced by a duty to arrange, which really makes contracting virtually compulsory. And I think this is something that we've really, in every local area, that you should be opposing. So what the government is slowly doing is moving us to accept that there will be less and less healthcare free at the point of delivery, and that in our fear we will start to move to take out private health insurance if we can afford to, or we will pay for services out of pocket because we're desperate to. And at the same time, it has a programme of more major cuts and closures through the STP plans. They're all about financial balance and cuts and closures. And it wants to shift the rump of care that will be left, healthcare, to local authorities through these new STP arrangements. And of course, as you know, local authorities have no clue about healthcare. Not only do they have no clue about social care either, because they're not providing any services directly in-house. And the fragmentation, the loss of access, the loss of our rights to healthcare are being increasingly eroded. So we have got an enormous fight on our hands if we don't want to go the American way. And that is exactly where we're going. And of course, it's not just the NHS. The American way is there in our schools, in the foundation schools, in the academy structures. All of these are being replicated and mirrored. So I think it's really important that we begin to understand why the NHS is being dismantled, the fact that the duty to provide is gone. There's a duty to arrange, which makes contracting virtually compulsory. The new mechanisms in the Act and subsequent regulations, which allow both for the shrinking of healthcare and our access to healthcare, for charging, and of course the establishment of foundation trusts and their new powers to get into joint ventures with healthcare corporations to franchise out whole wards, whole services. Pathology is just about gone, radiology is just about gone. The whole lot has been broken up and is now in the global marketplace, which is exactly where the American healthcare industry would like it to be. And I think we're probably, of all the European countries, we're the most advanced in terms of the breakup, the dismantling and the privatisation. There's absolutely no excuse for ignorance, because all across the country there are extraordinary campaign groups, mainly, I have to say, run by pensioners, and who have the memory, some of them, of what it was like, or their parents, not to have access to healthcare. They're campaigning on a shoestring, but people really understand what they're about to lose. And actually, for those of you tonight, the reason why I agreed to speak is because I hope that each one of you, as you go from here, will think about your part, what you can do, because it's not just for yourselves, it'll be for your children, for your grandchildren. It's an important legacy. This is a social contract, and the government is breaking and has broken this social contract. But it's not all over this fight, and there's still a lot to fight for. But I think it's very important that we understand what's happening. I said I'd take questions because I'm well aware that I'm going over time now. So I'm going to stop here, but this is why I think it's really important that you write to your MPs about the NHS bill. What's been shocking is that all the SNP, and there are about 50 of them, they support this bill in our English Parliament because they know, remember England, Wales, Northern Ireland still have a National Health Service. Scotland doesn't. But the problem is that the Treasury decides how much through the block grants, the Barnett formula, how much the other countries will get. So as England's being squeezed and gets less money, so will Scotland and Wales. And the real danger is that they will be forced and catapulted into doing what has happened in England. So we have the scenario of our Scottish cousins, Welsh cousins, Irish cousins having a universal healthcare system, a duty to provide on the Secretary of State. What can be more moving than that? And yet we no longer have that in England. I'm happy to take questions, and it is a very despondent and very gloomy outlook, but it's all there to fight for, and there are people in this audience who are doing a lot of fighting for our NHS. So I think if all of you could even leave today, do a few things, talk to 10 or 20 people, write to your MPs, say why aren't you supporting the bill, especially the Labour MPs, we need them to back this bill. I mean, the highlight for us of the bill was when Diane Abbott, when she was Secretary of State, Shadow Secretary of State for Health in the summer, actually Labour Party conference came in behind the bill. John Ashworth hasn't, and people like Andy Burnham, unfortunately, is too bound up with Devo Mank. But Devo Mank isn't going to offer a solution. The government wants the health service to be a patchwork of health services with inequitable entitlement, just like social care is and was. And of course, increasingly, it will be dependent on the wealth of local areas. Because remember, once the government devolves your health service to local areas, says you run it, it will withdraw the grant that it gives, and more money will be dependent on the local wealth of the local area. And there are many areas in the country, as you know, especially in the northeast, where I'm working now, which is about to lose £1 billion, will still simply not have the wealth to sustain a health service, which is why actually we need a national health service, because we'll have a race to the bottom if we don't, with enormous variations in entitlement, which we're beginning to see. This word postcode lottery will become a reality, except it's going to be a membership-based postcode lottery. Anyway, I'll stop now and I'll take some questions. Thank you.